Nick Newman had been through a lifetime of drama, heartbreak and family chaos, but nothing had prepared him for what he was about to uncover. The whispers had started weeks earlier. Strange sightings, odd behavior, and moments when people swore they'd seen Noah doing things that didn't make sense. At first, Nick dismissed it as stress. His son had been under pressure, trying to balance work, relationships, and the Newman legacy. But as the inconsistencies piled up, a chilling realization began to take hold: something wasn't right. Then came the day that shattered Nick's composure. The moment when his instincts screamed the truth at him so loudly that he could no longer ignore it. That was the day he came face to face with a man who looked like Noah, but wasn't. It had started innocently enough. Nick had been at Crimson Lights, trying to distract himself with a cup of coffee and his phone when he noticed Noah, sitting in a corner booth. The strange part wasn't that his son was there, but that he'd seen Noah earlier that morning, at Newman Media, in an entirely different part of town. The man at the cafe had his hood up, sunglasses on, and when Nick approached, he acted startled, defensive even. Something about his posture, the way he turned his face slightly away, set off every protective instinct Nick had. "Noah," he'd said cautiously, taking a step closer. The man froze, then smiled, too broadly, too forced. "Hey, Dad," came the reply, but the voice carried a faint distortion, like someone trying to mimic familiarity. Nick's stomach turned. "Take off your mask," he said before he could stop himself. The man's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, enough for Nick to see the flicker of fear behind the eyes that weren't quite Noah's. In that moment, time seemed to stand still. Nick's heart pounded as his mind raced to understand what he was seeing. The man in front of him wasn't just pretending to be Noah. He was wearing him, from the hair to the tone of voice, to the subtle mannerisms only someone studying Noah for months could perfect. But there was something off, a stiffness in his movements, a coldness in his gaze. When Nick repeated the command, "Take off your mask," the imposter's hand twitched near his neck, almost reflexively. Then without warning the man bolted. Nick shouted his name, or what he thought was his name, and chased after him through the cafe, spilling coffee cups and startling customers as he went. Outside, the fake Noah sprinted down the street, ducking into an alley. By the time Nick caught up, the man was gone, leaving only a torn piece of synthetic skin lying on the pavement. Nick stared at it, disbelief flooding his veins. The material looked almost human, eerily so. It was as if someone had peeled off a layer of another person's face. Panic surged through him as he thought of his real son. Where was Noah? Who was this man impersonating him, and why? Within minutes he was on the phone with Sharon, his voice trembling as he told her what had just happened. "Nick, slow down," Sharon said, trying to make sense of his words. "Are you saying someone is pretending to be Noah?" Nick could barely breathe. "Not pretending," he said. "It's more than that. It's like they became him." The fear in Sharon's voice was instant. "You think he's in danger?" Nick closed his eyes. "I don't think. I know." Back at the Newman ranch, Nick's mind wouldn't stop replaying the scene. He kept seeing those eyes, that smirk that wasn't quite right. He'd been fooled for a moment, but not long enough. His father's intuition had kicked in just in time. Victor Newman, when he heard, didn't take the news lightly. "Someone impersonating a Newman?" Victor growled, pacing the room. "This isn't just some sick prank, Nicholas. This is an attack." Nick nodded grimly. Victor immediately called his security team, demanding they track Noah's whereabouts. But every time they thought they had a lead, it led to confusion: sightings of Noah in multiple places at once. Sharon confirmed she'd seen him earlier that day, but he'd acted distant, almost robotic. Mariah mentioned something similar. Faith said Noah had texted her, but the messages were strange, short, emotionless replies that didn't sound like her brother at all. The deeper Nick dug, the more sinister it became. A security camera caught footage of Noah entering Newman Enterprises after hours. But when they confronted Noah about it the next morning, he looked genuinely confused. "Dad, I was home," he insisted, showing his phone's location data as proof. Nick believed him, but that only deepened the mystery. Someone had access to advanced disguise technology, enough to perfectly replicate Noah's appearance. When Victor had his tech experts analyze the footage, they found digital traces suggesting something even more bizarre. The imposter's face wasn't a mask in the traditional sense. It was biosynthetic material, something resembling experimental facial prosthetics. Victor suspected corporate espionage. Nick, though, felt something more personal beneath it all, like the impersonation wasn't just about business. It was about revenge. Days later, the imposter struck again. This time he walked into society, acting every bit like Noah, greeting familiar faces, ordering his usual drink. Everyone bought it. When Tessa saw him, her face lit up with affection, but within minutes, her expression changed. Something in his eyes unsettled her. "You okay?" she asked softly. "You seem different." The imposter smiled, leaning in too close. "Just tired," he whispered, but the tone sent a chill down her spine. When she mentioned Mariah's name, his reaction was delayed, calculated. That was enough. She stepped back, her instincts kicking in. Later, she called Nick and told him about the encounter. That's when Nick made the decision that would change everything. "If he shows up again," he told her, "don't confront him. Call me immediately." The following night, Nick set a trap. With Victor's help, he arranged for hidden cameras at Crimson Lights in society, places Noah frequented. Hours passed with no sign. Just as Nick started to think they'd missed him, the alert came in. The imposter had entered the bar area. Nick raced there in minutes, his heart hammering. This time there would be no escape. He entered quietly, watching from the shadows as the fake Noah chatted casually with the bartender. Everything about him screamed perfection. The voice, the expressions, the clothes. But when he turned his head, Nick saw the faint seam along the jawline, almost invisible but there. His blood ran cold. He approached slowly, every muscle tense. "Noah," he said, loud enough for the man to turn. Their eyes met. "Dad," the imposter said with a smile. Nick stepped closer. "Take off your mask." The bar went silent. The imposter's smile froze. His jaw clenched. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said evenly, but Nick wasn't fooled. He reached out suddenly, grabbing the man's wrist. The reaction was instant. The imposter yanked back, stumbling, and as he did, the edge of the mask peeled slightly. Gasps echoed around the room. "What the hell?" someone whispered. Nick didn't hesitate this time. "I said, take it off," he shouted, his voice shaking with fury and fear. The imposter backed away, cornered. Then, in a single horrifying motion, he ripped the synthetic mask from his face. The entire bar froze in collective shock. Underneath was a stranger. A scarred, unfamiliar face, eyes dark with malice. Nick stumbled back, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. "Who are you?" he demanded. The man smirked. "Let's just say," he replied coldly, "someone who lost everything because of your family." Before Nick could react, the imposter darted for the exit. Victor's men were waiting outside, but the man was fast, too fast. He managed to slip through a side door, disappearing into the night once more. All that remained behind was the discarded mask, Noah's face staring blankly up from the floor. Nick picked it up with trembling hands, feeling sick. This wasn't just about Noah. It was a message. Someone was targeting the Newmans through psychological warfare, through fear. Later, when Victor analyzed the mask, he discovered traces of high-tech polymers linked to a secretive biotech company, operating out of Genoa City's industrial sector. They specialized in experimental identity replication technologies, supposedly for government use. But someone had taken that science and twisted it into something monstrous. Noah, meanwhile, was shaken to his core. The idea that someone had been walking around as him, talking to people he loved, living pieces of his life, terrified him. "Dad, what if they hurt someone?" he asked quietly one night. Nick placed a hand on his shoulder. "They already have," he said. "They hurt you." But deep down, Nick couldn't shake a darker fear. What if this wasn't over? What if there were others? The thought haunted him, especially after new reports surfaced, sightings of Noah in other places at the same time. Victor refused to let it go, digging deeper, threatening to crush anyone involved. Sharon tried to hold the family together as panic grew, but Nick was spiraling. He couldn't stop thinking about that moment in the cafe. The fake smile, the voice that wasn't quite right. He'd seen evil before, but this felt different. It felt personal, invasive, like someone had reached inside their lives and stolen their identities piece by piece. Weeks passed, and the tension only grew. The imposter remained at large, but his presence was felt everywhere. Tessa received anonymous messages claiming Noah wasn't who he said he was. Mariah found strange packages left at her door. Photos of her and Tessa, taken from afar with captions like, "Do you know who you're really with?" Sharon started having nightmares about masks, about people peeling away faces only to reveal others underneath. And through it all, Nick became increasingly paranoid, jumping at every shadow, questioning everyone's motives. Victor warned him not to let fear consume him, but Nick couldn't help it. Every time he saw Noah, he found himself looking a little too closely, searching for some sign that it was really his son. It broke him inside, the not knowing, the constant doubt. Then one night, the imposter made his final move. Nick returned home to find a note slipped under his door. In neat, taunting handwriting it read, "One more mask to remove." The house was quiet, too quiet. He called out for Noah, no answer. Panic surged again as he ran room to room, until he found himself face to face with two identical Noahs. Both stood still, eyes locked on him, both claiming to be the real one. "Dad, it's me," one said. "No, he's lying," shouted the other. Nick froze, heart pounding, his mind spinning. This was the nightmare made real. He looked from one to the other, searching for some clue, some hint. Then he remembered something. A small scar on Noah's right hand, from a childhood bike accident. He glanced down. One of them had it. The other didn't. Without a word, Nick stepped forward and said, "Take off your mask." When the second man didn't move, Nick lunged, ripping away the false skin once more. The imposter screamed as the synthetic flesh tore, revealing the same scarred face beneath. But this time Nick was ready. He pinned him down until Victor's security stormed in. When it was over, and the imposter was finally in custody, Nick stood trembling. His son, the real Noah, clung to him, shaken but alive. The police later revealed the man's name, a disgraced former tech engineer fired from a Newmanbach startup years earlier. He had blamed Victor for ruining his life and had spent years developing the perfect revenge, infiltrating their family by stealing their faces. Nick couldn't shake the image of the man's cold eyes as he was led away. "You can't trust anyone," the imposter had whispered. "We all wear masks." In the quiet aftermath, Nick sat alone in the dim light of his living room, staring at his reflection. For the first time, he truly understood the meaning of those words. Everyone in Genoa City wore masks, not the kind you could peel away, but the ones built from secrets, lies, and pain. And even though the imposter was gone, the fear he'd planted lingered. Nick had faced him, unmasked him, but deep down he knew the scars would remain. Because sometimes the most terrifying mask of all isn't the one someone else wears. It's the one you wear to hide from yourself. And as dawn broke over Genoa City, Nick looked out the window and whispered to his reflection, "Take off your mask." But even he wasn't sure anymore who, or what, he'd find underneath. The polished brass of the doorknob felt unnaturally cold against Nick Newman's palm, a stark contrast to the feverish sweat that had begun to prickle at the back of his neck. He had entered the grand, silent foyer of the Newman ranch with the confident stride of a man returning to his own kingdom, his mind already leaping ahead to the confrontation he was sure to win, the verbal sparring with his father Victor, that was as much a part of their relationship as shared DNA. But the house was preternaturally still, the usual low hum of distant activity replaced by a thick, waiting silence that seemed to absorb the sound of his own footsteps on the marble floor. It was a silence that felt less like emptiness and more like a held breath, and it caused the first faint fissure in his certainty. He moved deeper into the living room, his eyes scanning the familiar landscape of leather sofas and framed art, and that was when he saw him. The figure was standing by the fireplace, his back to Nick, examining a small, ornate clock on the mantelpiece with an air of casual proprietorship. It was a posture Nick knew intimately, the slight tilt of the head, the set of the shoulders, the way one hand was tucked into a pants pocket. It was his own posture. A cold, sharp sliver of dread, entirely new and utterly terrifying, pierced through him. This was no simple lookalike. This was a doppelganger carved from his own reflection, a perfect mirror image standing in the heart of his own home. The man turned, and Nick felt the floor lurch beneath his feet. It was his own face that looked back at him, but it was his face as seen through a distorted lens. The same features, the same hair, the same knowing smirk, but animated by a consciousness that was utterly alien. The eyes, a perfect match in color, held a glint of cold, calculating amusement that Nick had never seen in his own mirror. "Nick," the double said, and the voice was the final devastating blow. It wasn't just an imitation. It was his own baritone, his own slight gravel, the very cadence and rhythm of his speech replicated with flawless, horrifying precision. It was hearing his own soul spoken back to him by a stranger. For a long, suspended moment, Nick was trapped in a nightmare of pure, unadulterated perception. His brain, the organ that processed reality, that distinguished self from other, friend from foe, simply short-circuited. It screamed two contradictory truths at once, that the man before him was himself, and that the man before him was a grotesque imposter. The psychological vertigo was so profound it manifested physically. A wave of nausea rolled through him, and he had to consciously steady himself against the back of a chair, the rich grain of the wood the only tangible anchor in a world that had suddenly turned to liquid. What is this?" he stammered, the words feeling thick and clumsy in his mouth, a pathetic counterpoint to the doppelganger's smooth, confident tone. The imposter, Noah, his mind supplied, the name a desperate, clawing grasp at sanity, merely smiled a slow, easy smile, the kind Nick himself used when he was about to close a difficult business deal. "Is there a problem?" Noah asked, his head cocked in a perfect imitation of feigned confusion. "I was just admiring the clock. A little ostentatious, don't you think? But then, Father always did have a flair for the dramatic." He said father with such casual, unearned intimacy that a fresh wave of rage cut through Nick's disorientation. This wasn't just an invasion of his physical space. It was a violation of his history, his relationships, the very bedrock of his identity. This thing was standing in his home, referencing his father with his voice. The sheer, brazen audacity of it was suffocating. Panic now began to crystallize from the initial shock, transforming from a diffuse terror into a sharp, tactical horror. This was not a random event, it was a meticulously planned attack. The precision of the impersonation spoke of resources, of time, of a deep and unsettling knowledge of his life. Who was behind this? A business rival seeking to destabilize Newman Enterprises? A vengeful enemy from the past he had long forgotten? His mind raced through a rogue's gallery of faces, but no one fit. This felt different, more personal, more profound. It was as if a snake had not just entered his garden but had learned to wear his skin. His thoughts spiraled to his family, to Sharon, to his children, to his brothers and sisters. Had this thing already interacted with them? Had it spoken to his mother, shared a joke with Victoria, comforted his daughter? The possibilities were a nest of vipers in his mind, each one spitting a different, potent venom of fear. He imagined this imposter sitting at the head of his table, laying a hand on Sharon's shoulder, making decisions in his name, and the image was so violently wrong it made his vision swim. His legacy, his name, the trust he had spent a lifetime building. All of it was being systematically dismantled by this phantom wearing his face. The foundation of his entire existence, which he had always believed was solid rock, was revealing itself to be sand, shifting and treacherous beneath his feet. Noah took a step forward, and Nick instinctively took a step back, the movement a humiliating admission of the power dynamic that had been established in mere minutes. He was the intruder in his own life, the ghost at the feast, while the imposter held the center. "You seem upset," Noah said, his tone dripping with a mock concern that was more insulting than open hostility. "Perhaps you should sit down. You don't look well." The gaslighting was expert, subtle. It was designed not just to deceive others, but to erode Nick's own certainty, to make him question the evidence of his own eyes and the sanity of his own mind. In that moment, Nick understood that the greatest danger was not the physical threat this man might pose, but the psychological war he was waging. The battle would not be fought with fists in this opulent living room, but in the minds of everyone he loved. The victory condition for this imposter was not to kill Nick Newman, but to replace him, to convince the world that he was the more authentic article. The real Nick would be the one they looked at with suspicion, the one whose stories didn't quite align, the one whose emotional responses seemed just a little too raw, a little too unhinged. He would be the copy, the flawed imitation, screaming his truth into a void of polite, concerned disbelief. A surge of primal, animalistic fury broke through the paralyzing fear. The urge to lunge forward, to smash that familiar yet alien face with his fists, To feel the satisfying crunch of bone under his knuckles and wipe that smug smile away with pain was almost overwhelming. His hands clenched into white-knuckled fists at his sides, his muscles coiling like springs. He could do it.